I have an interview with a wonderful documentarian about addiction coming up. So if that is not your cup of tea, no worries. You can head out if you'd like to. Um,
Yeah, I was gonna bring something up on terms of trigger warning or something along that line.
I'm gonna just change my title, so probably that
There
will
you
be
go.
sufficient. I'm pretty not pro trigger warning at all.
Yeah, I felt weird about it as well. I didn't know how to word it. I don't like the words specifically trigger warning. So,
Nope, that's the wrong.
well, hello.
Oh, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you?
Good. Let me just get it fully set up on my side.
Yeah, there you go. Can you hear me well, by the way?
Yeah, your audio is great. Do you maybe want
Okay,
to tell
good.
chat what we're talking about today while I
Okay, let me pull up my doc here. So basically, all right. I am I'm working on and a crowdfunded documentary style. I make videos, but this is more. I want it to trend more towards the documentary, or I don't know how to describe it. But I'm making a video on the topic of recovery, on the topic of addiction, and but not your normal like addict war story. This is my story of addiction side. I want to focus more of the taboo or shameful aspect that comes with the topic of addiction, and for addicts and how they feel stigmatized in that subject. So that's about it. Uh, and on for my end, do you mind when you get set up um, introducing yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Give me 2 more seconds. I have to
Yeah,
change my
take your time.
sensitivity on Discord.
I'm glad the 6 hours I spent testing my audio and camera it turned out well.
Yeah, what's the background? Is that like a wallpaper or a painting?
It is literally like a $12 Amazon tapestry. Um, the topic of this video is on my cousin who I lost in February to an overdose, and his mom he was obsessed with UFOs, obsessed with aliens, all that kind of stuff. So when he passed away, and I set up this area for my computer, I wanted something. So it's like a dude sitting and looking at the Earth from the moon. I don't know, and I have a green screen behind it, but
Yeah, it looks good.
yeah,
It looks really
it's,
good actually.
it's hit Amazon up; they'll hook you up.
Realizing I finally put up my last there. Wondering if it's over some of my identifiers super quickly.
Yeah, there you go. Much better.
Think that's enough just to blur it a little bit. Hopefully.
100% better.
I don't know if it actually is. But hopefully that helps.
Tuning that new camera, I can tell.
Yeah. Right. Well, hopefully that helps. I don't think you can see it super well, but just don't really want my
But now it's literally all
screen.
I can focus on. It's like all I can look at. So,
Yeah.
all right.
Hey, so it's about
Hey,
addiction, and what name would you prefer I introduce myself? Do you want my like actual name or my online handle?
you could do both. You could do both.
Okay.
Just yeah.
Well, my name is Kyla. I go by notsoErudite online. That's my online handle. I am a licensed addictions counselor and a psychometrician. That's my kind of formal licensure and training, with kind of plans in the future to be getting masters and whatnot in forensic clinical psychology. But I am not trained in those things yet.
Right. Well, that's perfect. That's perfect. Because all right, what I want to focus on is everybody who has talked about addiction, or I feel like despite the toxicity that you can see from some people, mainly on the addiction as a choice side of things, I feel like no matter what, almost everybody has some form of experience with addiction, be it their parent, be it themselves, their parents, their family, their friends. We've all been through high school. We've all seen everybody in our group, dabble in things, and then some people get caught on. But that's all. I feel like the approach that I want to take is slightly different. And you're perfect for this because I want more from my video. I want more of an explanation as to what is going on in the brain. That is, everybody behaves differently. Everybody reacts to a different to substances differently. Um, I'm also impressed at how well somebody can be in full blown addiction or full blown substance abuse and function 100% normally, whereas someone in the exact same situation would take that and run with it and use it as a way to do things that are commonly associated with addiction, stealing, just uh, that's where I want. So basically, what I want to talk about is what's going on in an addict's brain. If you can separate that from when you see someone going through this or see someone behaving in a way that is obviously because of their addiction. I really want to separate that from what is actually going on in terms of be it opiates, which is predominantly that's where my experience is. Um, I'm recovered myself, and we'll talk about the definition of that word in a minute. But so that's more. But I've seen addiction in every facet, and I mean from hard drugs to things that aren't necessarily substances, but just addiction in general. But the main point is the shame that comes from, let's say I've lost a few people to overdoses, and it seems like the common trope is that like the parents or the family when someone passes away, and obviously someone's going to ask, well, what happened? And or when they say, hey, so and so passed away from this, which an overdose or something, and they'll be like, let's keep that hush hush, or let's keep that on the, I want to know why that's such a thing. And then also, because of that, why it makes people so terrified to ask for help or to get to that point where you're willing to admit I have a problem. My behavior is pretty much influenced entirely by this, and I need help. Like, okay, so and then you see the document I sent you has the talking points or questions. If any of those stand out to you, you can jump on those. So,
Perfect. So where do you want to start?
um, I guess with I guess with the stigma of it, I guess that's probably the overreaching subject that I want to address. Like, why do we feel like so many people you know what, let's scratch that. The is addiction a choice or a disease issue? That's a huge one that I see so much toxicity from both sides online. The discourse is either people who have never done a drug in their life saying all you have to do is not do it, just don't do it, don't do the drug, don't do this. And then you have people like, you have no idea what it's like, it's a disease, it's literally classified a disease, blah blah blah. So like, where do you stand on that?
So the literature is really interesting because there. So a lot of people in the brain disease camp act like it's already solved and that's what it is. But if you actually look up the literature on this, there's warring camps on this of basically like, is it a brain disease? Is disease a good model to use? Is a medicalization of this a good model to use? To what extent is it a mental health disorder, which is kind of like a disease, but not quite? So where I stand on this is somewhere kind of in the middle. So I'll maybe give you the reasons why the different camps exist and the evidence for them. Because there's a lot of theories of addiction. So a lot of people see addiction as like disease or choice, but that's not all of the camps that there even exist in. That there's the kind of psychosomatic model, which kind of views trauma as like an extension, trauma as like a starting point for addiction. And then there's also kind of like more of a sociological view that like argues that like environmental triggers cause certain individuals to fall into addiction, but it's like more of like a sociological issue and like maybe like social cultural phenomena than it is like an actual disease. So the simple answer is it's probably it's probably a mixture of all of them. So the evidence for the brain disease comes from basically the fact that there is marked changes in specifically gray matter in the prefrontal cortex that we see in addiction. And we see this in both behavioral and chemical addictions, where we see a vast drop in gray matter when an addiction begins, and it's a really large brain change. Like it's a larger brain change than we even see with like schizophrenia onset, and so that's what kind of is the foundation for the brain disease model, is seeing like there's this organ that has this major change in response to the addiction. um, so that would be the evidence for the brain disease. The problem is that there's a couple of issues with the brain disease model. Number one, it seems like the changes in the brain happen. So first of all, the biggest issue is um, most people who do, for example, morphine, most people are going to have fentanyl once in their life. Um, you get fentanyl in almost every surgery, and most people also get codeine and morphine. Most people also don't develop addictions to these things. So the trigger point of this brain disease, like this brain shift, isn't clear. Like why is morphine not triggering it in lots of people? It's something that seems to develop the more you use. So is it a disease, or is it more of an injury as a result of choice that then
See,
becomes like a brain
that
injury?
that's actually a huge part of one of my points is my situation was when I was in high school, I had an injury on my hand and I had surgery and was, I guess, a lenient doctor in terms of post surgery, was very willing to, because it hurt. I mean, obviously, surgery's hurt. It was my first surgery. That was my first of seven. So, um, I'm 16 years old. I'm given a prescription post surgery. I end up taking those as prescribed. A few 6 weeks later or so, I go back and it's like, oh, how's it doing? Oh, it still hurts a little bit. Here's another one. So it's that, to the point where you're like, okay, it still feels a little sore, and then you end up taking a little more than is prescribed. You feel that for a little bit, and you're like, okay, this. So whether or not you're taking it because you realize there's a response in terms of how you feel taking it, and then versus just taking it long term via prescription, just whether or not your brain realizes there's a response, you're taking it daily or whatever, and it gets used to it. So I think what the doctor that helped me through my recovery said was, with every surgery, your chances of becoming addicted increase, exponentially or whatever. So when he asked me how many surgeries I have, I was like, I'm at seven at this point. He's like, okay, so maybe at some point this is not your fault. So that everybody having fentanyl or morphine at least one point in their life, that doesn't trigger it. But it's just crazy to me that even having it for therapeutic reasons, whether or not you're feeling that in that euphoria or not, is able to set that off. Now, what messed me up was continuing to be given that, and then that first experience of running out or not getting any more, and then feeling what that was like being without it. And so that's what to me set that fear off, because I think inevitably in every addiction it leads to, you stop caring completely about achieving that feeling of what it does. You care more about what it feels like to not have it. And that's where one of my points comes from, and these points is uh doctors, how do you feel about that balance you have to find as a medical professional of prescribing something to someone because you know they need it, versus the fear of what it can cause, and then also not prescribing it to people, making them go without it, which inevitably leads to finding an alternative, which is usually way cheaper, way more accessible, and way more harmful.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I do not covet doctors specifically like pain
Yeah.
doctors because what you kind of outlined is another issue with the brain disease model, which is there seems to be a pretty stark difference between a physical dependence and a psychological dependence, right? I'm not sure if you're familiar with the study that was done on Vietnam War veterans. Um, but when they came back, they studied a bunch of Vietnam War veterans that were all addicted to heroin while in
Mhm.
Vietnam. Once they
Yeah.
came back, only 2% remained addicted, even though they claimed to be addicted in Vietnam, right? And so it's like,
Okay.
okay, well, that doesn't make any fucking sense with a disease model. Like, if this brain change has
Mhm.
happened, you shouldn't just be like going back home isn't enough to change your brain and suddenly not be addicted. And
Yeah.
so the brain
It
disease
it throws that situational situation into the mix. Yeah.
the brain disease model falls apart, I think, because like when we medicalize an organ like the brain, our understanding, first of all, our medical understanding of other organs isn't really generalizable to how the brain works because the brain is such a unique organ. So to put a medical label on something that we barely understand medically,
Mhm.
and we don't understand from any level of like ideological or even like functional perspective is probably presumptuous of us to do. And there is some evidence that people with addiction who prescribe to a medical model of brain disease actually relapse more because they have less
Yeah.
hope about it because they think, well, I just
It
have a
less hope,
disease.
and then it's
I just
also a
need professionals.
very convenient excuse as well.
Yes. Yes, it is.
It's very, especially because the topic of what comes there, you don't see many old addicts. You don't see very many I mean, just old people who are success like you either you either burn out early when you or you learn to be a very good addict, and with that comes the manipulation. It comes the hiding it, which is probably what it trains people to be the best at, is being secretive. So where that comes from, like, oh, what was I going to say, just just that mindset. It's a very sensitive subject for me, so I'm trying to word this in a way that's not, I don't want to make this about my personal experiences, but it's hard not to put those together. But what it does is it completely changes your behavior in a way that you feel like you have to hide things, and when you're hiding it, uh, you you know what's right at the time, and you know what's not right when it comes to that. That's where the shame part of it comes in. Like, for doing research for this video, I've been watching a lot of videos of, it seems to people who, especially heroin in a lot of the big cities where fentanyl and heroin are a problem, people pull their phones out and they're videoing them. And so many of them, when they're being confronted, they're like, "Hey, man, you're high, or you're getting high again." They're like, "No, I'm not. I'm just tired." They immediately want to lie about it and say that's not what's going on. So the big part for me is as a medical professional, how can you tell when someone is putting on that act that they have to put on, like 24/7 for you, or like for me, who I had chronic pain, I have a bone disease, I've had injuries, but mainly I have a problem with a bone disease in my foot. And like, when I go to a doctor, when I was deep in it, I knew that he was going to hear me saying, "I'm hurting, I want something for it." But how do you know that's me as a chronic pain sufferer versus an addict trying to get his medicine?
Yeah. I mean, this is an issue that we deal with all the time in recovery is like, is this genuine need or drug seeking behavior? And sometimes the problem is that it's both.
Mhm,
Because there's a lot of people in pain who do need supports. But they also, when you offer them, like, for example, there'll be doctors who are like, well, this as they might not want to give them like another barbiturate. They might try to offer like some sort of like
mhm,
much more mild alternative, like a gabapentin or something like that. And then you see the client get resistant and they're like, no, 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 I don't want that. And then they're like, okay, right. The doctor wants to, like, I've seen some practitioners jump to, oh, well, they're just drug seeking. And I'm like,
Mhm.
Sort of, they are, right? They're like, there's
Yeah.
this addict part of them that is obsessing about the drug that they want, but it's probably fueled by legitimate, like they might also legitimately be in pain. Like it might be both
Mhm.
going on. And
It's
so,
and it's such a terrible mixture as well.
yeah.
And I think the point on there was the doctor that I worked with told me about how I noticed when I started weaning off, I had terrible chronic pain. I'd be taking X amount of medicine, doing whatever, going to other alternatives, but it felt like my pain was worse when I was doing these things. And so, like, and he told me the brain, when it's, especially with an opiate addiction and you do have pain, it learns that, okay, when you're hurting, I get this, you take this medicine. So when I got off of this medicine, I was hurting less, which to me sounded so, it just contradicted everything I knew. And he's like, yeah, your brain is like, okay, if I make this dude hurt a little bit more, I might get, what's going on. And I don't think people understand how potent that the withdrawal phase can be and how it can change your behavior entirely. So,
Have you ever heard of something called a CCR, or a counter conditioned response?
um, I don't think that specifically.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. So most people that I talk to in the addictions field, even most practitioners, don't know about this. It comes from behavioral psychology, actually, but it is fundamental to understanding withdrawals and why specifically getting off. Everything that it helps you treat is going to get worse for a while. So it's hard to explain this without images, but basically, your brain, your body always pursues something called like homeostasis, right? It wants to be in balance. It wants to have enough sugar that you don't die, but not so much sugar that you start like poisoning. So it's got insulin, and insulin kind of regulates this and kind of tries to keep it on balance. You've got a bunch of internal things to help you balance your body heat, your stomach pH. And so opiates and meth and all sorts of things, they typically play on real systems in our body. So for meth, it would be your dopamine. It releases
Mhm.
excess amounts of dopamine. Opiates, they act on endorphin receptors, and they opiates, depending on what type of opiate it is, it either causes your endorphins, your body to release more endorphins than it normally would, or the chemical compound itself mimics the shape and like quantum size essentially
Mhm.
of a natural endorphin, and it locks into your brain receptor as an endorphin. So that's typically, and then there's a couple others that stop like enzymes from eating your endorphins and stuff like that. So there's a couple of ways in how these drugs work, but they basically act on a natural system, which would be your endorphin
Mhm.
and dopamine system. So tolerance is basically built by your counter conditioned response. So for example, if you take 10 units of meth. Let's just make this really simple. 10 units of meth, and
Mhm.
it releases 1,000 units of dopamine into your brain. That is going to put your homeostasis way out of whack. And your
Mhm.
body's going to go like, how do you feel about swearing on your video?
Go for it, hunt. Like
Okay.
like do it more than you normally would. Even better.
Okay.
Like,
Your body is going to be like, oh, fuck, this isn't normal. And it's going to
Mhm.
start releasing a whole bunch of enzymes and a whole bunch of things to try to balance out the dopamine. But it's not used to it. So it's going to take a long time, which is why the first high is always the most intense, because you have no tolerance and you have no counter conditioned response.
The
However,
dragon.
your body hates it. And so what it does is it conditions a whole bunch of things immediately to go, what are cues that we're about to get a big dump of dopamine? And it starts to decrease your production of dopamine, and it starts releasing way more dopaminergic enzymes as well to basically prepare for the dump of dopamine. So a lot of people who use drugs typically use it in the same spaces. It's their home, their house,
Mhm.
their bathroom. So there's going to be little markers and primers where your body goes, uh-oh, you know, endorphins incoming. And so what they're going to do is they're going to start dropping down your natural endorphins. They're going to start increasing all of your wakefulness stuff
Gotcha.
to counterbalance before you take it, so that when you take it, it has less of an effect on you. And that's what tolerance is. So when you're going through withdrawal, hey, Sansel, thanks for the raid. When you're going through withdrawal, you're actually going through and you're living with your counter conditioned response. So withdrawal is always going to be the opposite of what the drug does to you. So if endorphins decrease pain and basically increase sleepiness. When you are withdrawing, you are going to experience a natural increase in pain because your body is intentionally underproducing natural endorphins. So every fucking thing is going to feel like electricity. Like you're going to get a touch on your arm and it's going to feel like a bruise. You're going to be hyper sensitive because our bodies are releasing endorphins all the time, right? That's why I can go like this and it doesn't really hurt. If you have no endorphins in your body, that would actually hurt a lot. That would hurt quite a bit because endorphins dampen that impact, right? And so this is something that almost no one ever knows about when I talk to. Thank goodness for my behavioral psychologist supervisor teaching me this. This is what withdrawal is you're going through your counter conditioned response, and it takes a while for your body to be like, hey, I don't think they're going to dump. And it's also going to be conditioned on circadian rhythm. So your body's going to learn, hey, this person seems to dump drugs into me every 8 hours. So it's going to be dropping down your endorphins
And it's
constantly to
it's a
prepare.
desperate, hopeless feeling too, which drives good people to do bad things, or at least say or just do anything that they don't normally do. And especially what sucks about it for most people is they're doing it while consciously aware that what they are doing goes against the norm, goes against what if they were high that they would ever even consider doing. But at that point, I guess you're just so used to having the stasis in your brain, and it's so different that you are just and you talking about that your body preparing for that release or whatever. I feel like anybody who's ever done drugs or feel like they needed drugs knows that feeling when they're like on their way to get what they need, or like if they are buying something from someone, that trip from just like, okay, yeah, come get it, but from that point to getting to it is an experience that I don't think, unless you've experienced yourself, you can understand. It's your body is just like, and what sucks is when you're deep in it, and I'm talking years and years deep in it, like I said, you don't see very many old addicts. There's either recovered ones, or unfortunately they're no longer here. um they Once they get to that point, like you said, I guess since everything is so off balance, once you get it, there's no high anymore, or there's no, it's just the return to what you feel is normal. And I don't think so. I think that's where the stigma comes from. Is a lot of times, especially for me and for my cousin, when something seemed off about them, or like let's say you see them and the way they're behaving, you're like, oh, I think they're on something or doing something. Chances are that the problem was is that we weren't on anything. That wasn't baseline anymore. And that shift, that Jekyll and Hyde situation where you're a completely different human, wasn't because you were, it's because you weren't. And that's where a lot of that shame and that embarrassment comes from, is when someone calls you out on that behavior that isn't normally you. You're like, oh, that's because I'm not high. You know what I mean?
Mm.
That's Yeah, so that's a huge thing that people don't understand. And my main worry is, especially so, when I lost, his name is Chandler, and he was my best friend, my first cousin. He passed away in February from a fentanyl overdose, and it happened um exactly when we used to, I hate to say this, we our humor together was very dark, and like we were very, he was aware that I'm recovered, but I was also very aware of what he was going through, and doing my best to talk, to help him. But you can only help so much, and I would give him as much information as I could. You can't say, hey, this worked for me, so this is what you need to do. It just
Right.
doesn't work like that.
Right.
And that's why I don't like, I honestly hate talking with addicts. I hate talking with recovered addicts. I hate talking because it inevitably leads to just localized personal stories and comparing, and then it ends up in a, I call, I think everybody calls them war stories. That's what I don't like. And so we were very open about what he was going through, and I would always mess with him because he got to the point where he was trying to get better, and he saw that I was proud of him, and then he would hide that he was still using, and pretend that he wasn't. So he would just be like, "Man, I've been doing well. I haven't done anything in this long." And I'm like, "Okay, whether or not that's true," I was like, "You understand without any form of help or addressing what's going on mentally or chemically, be it through Suboxone treat, whatever it is." I was like, "You understand that it doesn't really work like that because there's going to be a you might feel good now. Like everything's okay right now, but there's going to be a day where you're bored, you're alone, you're um something just bums you out, you're having a bad day." And that's exactly what happened. I think that maybe he was telling the truth to some extent or slowing down, had a bad day, was alone. It was a Friday, paycheck day, and he passed away. And it sucks that I used to tell him, I was like, that's what's gonna happen, unless you're honest with me and just we'll do whatever it takes to get you help. But it was just that shame of of wanting to show that I beat this, or I don't want people to look down on me for this. And I feel like that there wouldn't be such a stigma if the discourse on I guess all discourse online sucks. Like you can't have a single opinion online without hordes of people just dying on hills that they know nothing about. But is there any way we could ever get to a point where someone would feel comfortable being like, "Yeah, yeah, I'm totally freaking addicted." Be it I got prescribed too many pain pills, or I used to hang out with a dude and he always had heroin and we tried it a little bit and I like it too much. Not like do you think we'll ever get to that point where there's not that stigma, or because it could be sex, it could be alcohol. I mean, you can go to the gas station and buy the same shit that will do, chemically do to you what opiates or meth or any addictive substance will do. Like, do you think we could ever get there, or
I'm not sure. And I'm not sure. See, like, reduction in stigma seems to have. I'm not sure. So we want to reduce shame. Like, in my view, what I want to reduce is like shame um,
yeah,
versus just stigma. It's tricky to reduce all stigma because, as you wrote in your notes as well, there's a lot of really nasty negative behaviors associated with people in addiction. Like people in
yeah,
addiction
on both sides,
on
on
both
both sides.
sides, right? Like
Yeah,
people with addiction are both oftentimes abused, but also often abusers.
mhm,
They are mistreated, but they also mistreat others. They steal, they
yeah,
engage. Most crime is done in the service of addiction. And so to like fully reduce the stigma, I think is it the right goal to have, or is the goal
yeah,
better to have like what I'm more for is like relapse prevention mentality. So
mhm,
like I'm not right, I'm not going to convince like somebody who has no experience with addiction. Um 'Cause here's the thing I struggle with when I talk to like people in the addiction world is they kind of say like everyone has an experience with addiction. Everyone knows what it is. And it's like that's
mhm.
not true. That's actually not true. When you start talking to normies, they have no idea. Their
Yeah,
understanding of
and you know what?
addiction is
That's
homeless
fair.
people. And
That's fair.
it feels like everyone should, but the reality is that when somebody who's like an extended family member falls into addiction, they mostly just fall off the map for people. They might not even
Yeah,
fully be aware. They just kind of like hear 10 years later being like, oh, did you hear like estranged Uncle John died of like liver failure? I guess he was like an addict and
yeah,
stuff. And you're like, oh, I didn't realize that, right? And like you just like don't really maintain contact. And so, like, a
yeah,
really big struggle in the addictions field, and I like have to badger my CEO about this all the time, where she's like, everyone has a relationship to addiction. I'm like, no. And even if you do, people are ashamed of addiction. It's not like cancer. Like you can make cancer kind of this like beautiful tragedy. Like addiction is hard to do that because if you've
mhm,
lived with people with addiction, it's not really beautifully tragic. It's just
yeah,
tragic. It's just
yeah,
tragic and it's fucking frustrating as well. And you like waffle like this. I've as somebody who's like worked with both like addicts and like family members is like family members and addicts waffle between loving and hating each other um,
mhm,
for really justified reasons. And so um, I don't know if stigma is the right approach, but I really, really, really want to encourage relapse prevention mindsets, particularly within the field of addiction itself. I think there's a lot of people who say that they're pro relapse prevention and like relapse prevention mindsets. So basically, my view is you're going to fuck up. Okay.
yeah.
Relapse
It's
is 60% likely. It's going to happen.
I was just about to interrupt you, unfortunately, and say that I avoided as much counseling or as much group therapy that's in there as well. But unless it was one on one with my doctor, because I felt like he knew what he was talking about. But I've heard that relapse is part of recovery, and that's such a huge thing, and a huge hurdle to cross. I would assume for people dealing, like my wife is 100% the only reason that I got clean. She is the rock that helped me through that, and it sucks that most people can't have that support. Couldn't have done it without support, and support is hard to find. It's expensive. It's almost a privilege. So yeah, that relapse aspect, I don't think people realize that it is probably, and I don't know statistics, and I'm definitely not. I try to keep my recovery really contained, but I feel like relapse is probably way just as easy to do on day 3 of sobriety as it is on year 14. You
Yeah.
know, and I had to slip up 5 years into mine, and literally, even though that is the one thing that I hate more, but when something is put literally right there, like it's wild that people don't realize that how possible that is. Just for that. So the relapse, and I feel like if it is part of recovery, and if it is inevitable, that it is, that people don't feel like they failed. They don't feel like they have to say "fuck it, I'm done." I slipped up. It's over with. I'm back on it. So the whether or not you can prevent the relapse or anything, I feel like that you should at least know that it's probably likely to some extent. So
Right. And so, like,
that's it.
I really try to encourage people in and around addictions, whether it's like loved ones or anything, is like, how do we respond to a relapse? Well, first of all, we take accountability, we own it immediately, and then we really have to make sure not to shame it, right? Because there's this like response. I would always get frustrated with like people, like other practitioners in the field, where like a client would relapse and they'd be like, well, now we have to kick them out of the program because, like, for the reasons of the program, in this case, there was kids on site. We literally couldn't have somebody who's been using on site for
Mhm.
unless they've been clean for 7 days. Um, but it's like, ugh, we don't want relapses to become the end of the world, because like
Yeah.
most people when they OD, it's on a relapse
Yeah.
because they usually it's not their first
Your
relapse. It's
tolerance is gone. Your
your
tolerance,
tolerance is
yes, yeah,
gone,
it's
and you
gone.
binge. So if you don't die on your
Mhm,
immediate relapse, you often die on your binge, right? Because
mhm,
typically when people relapse, they definitely don't just go, I'm just going to use once, just a little bit, and then I'm going to go right back to it, right?
mhm.
They're typically like, I'm fucked. It's all over. I've lost all
Yeah,
my
it's
days of
done with.
sobriety. Life is over, and I'm
Yeah,
starting from the beginning. And it's
yeah,
like, we have to figure out some balance in between this. This is why, like, I think like being proud of how many days you have sober is really understandable, but it also puts a lot of pressure on you
a lot of
that if you
pressure.
relapse, you're back down to day zero, which is really
'Cause ho
scary. And then you don't want to
and
own it, and then you don't want to get the help that you need, and then you don't want to do
especially when
relapse
you have
prevention.
a drawer full of two-day chips, or, something like that, and that's unfortunately, I don't wanna call him a friend, but it was a guy I knew that was the same situation, and it happened literally 2 days before his overdose. Some people are okay with being very public with that aspect of their life. I have no judgment at all. To me, the shame, the embarrassment aspect, I withdrew. I tried to keep that until recently, try to keep that a very separate part of like who I am. But on Facebook, posting his 24 hour, his 1 day chip, that he got the tattoo of I stayed away from AANA type stuff, but to thine own self be true, is that it? Or something like that.
Probably.
Got
I didn't work with an
yeah,
NA model
yeah.
either.
Okay, yeah, okay, good, cool. I'm just as unfamiliar. Got that tattoo and everything, and I think I'd messaged him, and I was just like, "Hey, man," because people were like ripping on him because he was a chronic relapser. I was like, "Look," because he was shitting on people who take Suboxone, blah blah. That's a whole different story. But I was like, "Look, man, I'm so glad you're clean and stuff." I was like, "But until you have like a stack of those chips, like quit putting down people going through their struggle or whatever." And 2 days later, he overdosed, and what's especially scary is for me, there was such a gap between my literal Like, not even just my deciding to get sober, but, like, I did 6 months of Suboxone treatment and counseling and all that. But from 5 years from that point, like, fentanyl really was not a thing around here. I went from the pain pill to heroin situation, and, um, fentanyl just didn't exist, and when I did relapse, it was my cousin who I've been talking about. When he came back here, he was like he was ashamed that he was using fentanyl, and like he was really ashamed of it. But he was like, "Look, I just want to let you know I have some heroin." And I was like, I'll do, yeah." I was like, "Fuck," it's right there in your face. And the second, what I didn't know though was it was fentanyl, and I knew it was like kicking my ass more than I was ever used to, and it scares me to death to know that that literally could have been game over for me.
Yep.
But that gap in time, the further you go and then you do the relapse, like you said, most overdoses being on that relapse, like that could have been it, and that's just so. But the fact that he was so ashamed to admit to me that it was fentanyl, that he was like, "Oh, it's just heroin." Like, it's no big deal, you know what I mean? So to me, that was just, so I could see that, but immediately, like you said, to own it, and my wife, she knew Jrayke. Like, she knew when I was on something and I would deny it and I would lie to her face, and then when I finally got over all that, and then when I relapsed, she came in the bedroom. I'd been in bed sleeping all day or whatever, and she goes, What have you been doing?" And I just looked her in the eyes and I said, "Heroin." Like, and that's a huge deal around here. That's a very huge deal because that's the only issue we had ever had in terms of trust was my drug use and trying to hide it. So I felt like, even though yes, I did relapse. I did for one night. I did what I was given. But the fact that when she asked me what it was that I was doing, and I was able for the first time to look her in the eyes and say, "I'm not," not say I'm sleepy or I'm tired or I don't feel good. Like, I just said it's heroin, which probably should have made her just turn around and leave. But that was probably the biggest step, and or one of the biggest moments that I was able to admit, like, "Oh shit, I might be better." You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like, when I was ashamed, when I got zero pleasure or benefit for what I did, and her being able to tell, and me being able to own up to it, it's not even an option from this point on, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And like, and this is the tricky thing of like, well, how do we get rid of all the shame? And it's like, it's tricky, right? Like, hopefully you're surrounded by like loved ones who won't add unnecessary levels of shame, but like, there's also a level of responsibility that we have to hold of like, how do you say, I'm not blaming you. We're not doing the like, you made this choice,
Mhm,
but it's still your responsibility to get clean because you're the only one who can do it, right? That's just the reality of it. It is on every single individual addict to get into recovery, to recover. No, I always tell my clients, I can't do it for you. Um, because I can't. I can't drag you past the finish line. It's on you. And so this is like this dialectic between like choice or like choice versus like non-choice is being like, it's probably, whether it's empirically true or not, it's probably seems to be most helpful when we have some level of balance where we say, you're responsible for the actions, even though I don't blame you for them.
mhm,
Your next steps are the choices that you get to make, and like the level of like how much are you choosing it. Sure, we can like get
mhm.
into that, but fundamentally, like, I'm very big on like, we have to empower clients of saying like, the next choice has to be yours, which is why I'm very big on like, yeah, relapses happen and it's okay. It's not the end of the world. Is it good? I'm not going to sit here and be like, it's good, but I'm not blaming you. You're not a bad person for
I
relapsing.
think
It's a
I think
nature of
even
this problem.
Yeah, and Destiny, I think he says it, like, about apologies, like, he's like, "Don't fucking apologize to me." Like, if you fuck up, if you do something like that, just don't do it again, or, like, say, "Yeah, I fucked up," and just because you saying, "I'm sorry," and then the next day you turn around and do it again, what's the fucking point?
Mm.
But, that's a big part of it as well, like, that that feeling of being like, okay, I can admit this and I know that we can work through this, but that's just such, again, it's such a privilege. When I would go to my doctor appointment, I was kind of, it was part of it to sit with everyone there waiting to see the doctor, which was our form of group therapy, which I guess can lead us into. I've heard you talk about your how much you advocate for group therapy. Um, do you feel the same way about that when it comes to addiction therapy, or is that just your view of therapy overall? Because personally, which is anecdotal, but personally, I cannot stand being in a group of addicts. Like, as an addict, I'm recovered. I will always admit to having an addicted brain, but God, it's exhausting to sit and listen to people in recovery talk. Uh, uh, Maybe 5 minutes we can get like a good conversation going, and it just devolves into two war stories to like, well, yeah, you used to buy 14 pills a day, I used to spend $300 a day, well, I used, and then it goes downhill from there. And to me was very frustrating because I went in with an analytical brain, like, I have this problem. I set a 6 month goal. I told my doctor, this is what I want you to prescribe me, and how often, like this. But most people don't get that privilege in terms of having someone help them pay for it, or at least going into it knowing like their problem. So, d- I guess long story short, does your group therapy uh, feeling translate into addiction therapy as well?
Yeah, so I'm very much of the view that like the treatment that we apply has to broadly be matched to the severity of the disorder. So I would view it, so I view addiction in a bit of a complex way. I would view like basically I think there's kind of two forms of addiction that we probably deal with. This is purely my opinion, by the way. It's not empirical
Mhm.
because there's, let's be honest, there's not a lot of
And
good science about addiction
I
in
was gonna say
general.
that's about all you can have when it comes to this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, we know a bit of like brain structures, but beyond that, like people don't really do good research on addiction. And there's very little of it in general. But I basically view like we have one group so that seems to be chronic relapse prone individuals where it doesn't really matter what level of intervention we give them, they're going to relapse, and the whole journey of their life is making those relapses as minimal as possible so that they can have a successful, thriving life in between these relapses and making the relapses as far apart as possible. And then there's another group that I call like my stress addicts who, like, due to some environmental thing, whatever it is, they fall into addiction. If enough stress occurs again, they might relapse, but they're not chronic relapse prone where like these people will relapse for any reason. Like it's like, oh, I got the job, time to
Yeah.
relapse. Oh, I lost my
Yeah.
job, time to relapse. Oh, it's sunny out, time to relapse.
Yeah.
Oh, it's raining out,
Yeah.
like
It's
any
time to
excuse.
celebrate. Yeah.
Any
Time to
excuse.
celebrate, or time to be bummed out. Like, either way. Yeah.
And so I think we don't have this nuance of seeing different like levels of severity of addiction and types of addiction, just like we barely have that nuance. Like we're just finding out that this is the case for depression, that there's actual like stress triggered depression versus a biological circadian type of depression. I suspect we're going to see something. The reason why I think there's so many like theories of addiction that all have a fair bit of evidence behind them suggests to me that there probably is kind of this psychosocial form of addiction, and there is this much more biological, like biomarker form of addiction. And probably the way that we treat these actually needs to be a little bit different. Um, I'm very big on group therapy for addicts as
Mhm.
well, but when I do group therapy in a general populace, I'm a lot less structured about it. Whereas when I'm doing it in an addiction populace, because addiction, especially when you're dealing with dominantly, in my experience, I'm working with chronic relapse prone people. So people who have been on the streets or in jail, because those are the two places
Yeah.
that they oscillate between due to their
Yeah.
addiction. So very, very severe cases. I'm very, very structured in how my group therapy works. I'm very clear about the expectations, right? So I'm very big on like, we can talk about our past, but we're not here to glorify your addiction because glorification
Yeah.
is relapse behavior. You are
Yeah.
in relapse mind when
You
you're
and
glorifying your past.
you can sense that point too when someone
You can
starts
feel it
telling their trauma, and then
getting
it
hungry.
starts perking them up.
Yeah. They
Exactly.
get hungry. You
100%.
can like
Yeah.
feel it, and
Yeah.
I'm very hard on that. So like this is the thing. This is why like whenever I talk publicly about like addiction therapy, everyone's going to think addiction therapists are assholes because we're very firm, especially when somebody like I have got clients who've got 7 days of sobriety and they've been using for 25 years, right?
Mhm.
the level of structure that I need to ensure that that person doesn't slip back and die is very high. It's very different. It's in some ways infantilizing, right? You're not going to have your phone. You're not going to call your ex. You're not
Yeah.
going to leave the building for a little while. You're not going to be watching any TV shows or listening to any music that glorify addiction. You're not going to do any of these things. And people are like, well, it's really controlling. And it's like, yeah. And
Mhm.
people are
At least it's
dying.
one form of stress. It's the only
Yeah.
stress, and I control it. Yeah, I
Yeah.
understand that.
Yeah. It's just
Yeah.
like, we don't want to put people back into like relapse mind. So my group therapies, I'm very big on existential group therapy. I really, really like it for just in general. I just love existential group therapy, and that's my main clientele I've done it with. I've actually done almost exclusively existential therapy with this severe addiction population.
Mhm.
So it's very big on, we talk about the here and now. So we talk about emotional interchanges between us. We make goals of social interpersonal skills we would like to work on in this session. Um, when we're talking about like group therapy, because a lot of group therapy is like, let's just talk about our addiction stuff. I
Yeah.
find it's never very helpful. I,
Mhm.
in that case, prefer way more psychoeducational classes. So I love, like, it's hard to call it therapy because you're like, when you educate, in my case, the women, because I was at a women's shelter. Um,
Mhm.
and then you assign them certain skills and stuff to practice to talk about. And so you give them very structured questions to be answering and asking one another so that they're getting some level of like talking to people about their stuff because they need to learn how to talk about their addiction well. But it's not devolving into glorifying and stuff like that. Because yeah, I see a lot of that, and it's really, really unhelpful to
That
anyone in
that
addiction.
that brings me to also in your Twitch chat, Chi-Town Jacob. I see your questions and I like your engagement. I'm not responding, but I am reading your stories there. So that brings me into with your therapy. I like that analytical aspect of it because personally, for me, and I think this is why I avoided the AA aspect of it. For me, religion was not the play. Um, Personally, like that's just not. Albeit how much I respect, the religious aspect of anybody's lifestyle. For me, that was not my route to recovery because I'm locked in the mental aspect of it and not really so much as the spiritual or anything greater than me. So the second kind of got in that environment and it was that surrender yourself, you are powerless, let God take control. Is to me, how do you feel about the benefits of the religious recovery, I guess, versus just the strictly educational, this is what's going on, this is what will fix it side of it? Which I'm sure is probably harder in a like jail or institution setting, I would assume.
Yeah, it's really complicated. A lot of people in recovery really, really benefit from engaging in a
Yeah.
spiritual practice
I'm
because often, here's the thing. So here's the thing that is really difficult to overcome, which is that when you're getting out of addiction, you are losing the one thing that will always be there for you and will always make you feel better and is available at any time. And no human will ever replace that. None.
yeah.
Not even a
Yeah.
partner, right? And so if I'm being very like analytical and secular about it, it's possible that the spirituality is somewhat replacing that. Um, and basically being that 24 available call out to help source essentially.
Well, I
Um,
think an addict specializes in being alone or internalized, so I think that might help with that because you can be alone and have that at the same time.
right.
So,
But
yeah,
I don't want to dismiss people's religious experiences either, right? I
a-
don't want to say that like
absolutely.
it's just like they're just switching their heroin for God, right? Like
Yeah, yeah.
people who believe, right? And I say this as somebody like I'm openly like also spiritual, right? And so it's like there's weird evidence about like conversion and how like conversion can be like highly effective for treating it, like conversion as in like basically experiencing a major spiritual experience can be really effective at changing addictions. But we are seeing some research that like DMT might replace this. In general though, I think religion should be something that is in my view, like anything you're adding into a treatment of, especially somebody who's so severe, should only be helpful to them.
Mhm.
Right. So the shelter that I worked at was a Christian shelter. I was very firm, at least in like how I engaged with my clients, that if they would like it, I would love to share it with them. And if they weren't interested, that's fine. There's still tons of
Yeah.
skills and whatnot that I can give you that are completely non-religious based. Because if you're religious, you would argue God made science, so you should be
Yeah,
using that too.
exactly.
Um,
100%.
just to speak on NA and AA, in general, when people are like asking me like, should I go to AA and stuff? What the evidence shows for beneficial, basically, if you're somebody who all of your social network is filled with other people with pretty significant addiction, AA can be really beneficial because you have a pretty high chance of at least meeting somebody who's going to be sobriety minded. And you're going to have a hard time making those connections outside of AA because it's clear
Yeah.
that in your social network, all you know is how to befriend addicts. But if you're
Yeah.
somebody with addiction who actually has a decent social support system that is sober or doesn't have addiction themselves, AA seems to be actually worse overall for recovery.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially because I feel like if I were in my situation with zero support, that feeling of giving yourself or finally being able to admit to some extent that you are powerless, or at least to be able, albeit whether it's true or not, to be able to, like, for once shift blame onto something other than yourself, because it's pretty open that as an addict all this shit is because of your choices. So I feel like that would probably give someone struggling with that, with no one else to say, look, I hear what you're going through, um something, I don't want to say just something to blame it on, or not blame it on, to be there with them when they're alone, or to shift some type of greater power into responsibility. Just for me, I couldn't personally do that, but I could, God, I could see that being really helpful.
So I think that's often how it's used religiously. Submission to the higher power is very big as far as a process of like letting go, like the let go, let God idea. So I think a lot of people misconstrue the religious idea within AA, to just being like, just admit that you're powerless. And it's like,
Mm.
that's not what we want to do. That's not an incremental mindset at all.
Yeah.
We want incremental mindsets here. The
Mhm.
idea of admitting you're powerless, like if we're looking actually at like what like most religious bodies view as this submission as, it's typically a process of like essentially letting go of anxiety, specifically of like letting go of fears of future and whatnot, because you're like, I believe in this deity, whatever it is, that loves me and cares for me, and I don't need to sweat and worry. Like it's the idea of like, if God loves a sparrow so much to provide, how much more will he do for me? So it's more of a practice of like submitting your fears and letting them go. Like kind of like ACT therapy would describe it as like, view your fears as leaves on a river and watch them move
Yeah.
on. Notice that they're there, but let them go. It's kind of the exact same meditative process. But yeah, a lot of people go into like, I'm hopeless and there's nothing I can do without God. And it's
Yeah.
like, sort of, but the idea behind that should be fundamentally, I need to let go because my worrying and fretting and whatnot, like this is what the ancient literature noticed. Like there's tons of stories. There's very non-Christian stories, by the way. Like the story of
Mhm.
Tiamat and Absu. I don't know if you know the Mesopotamian gods or anything like that.
Not gonna lie and say that I do.
Yeah, that's
So no,
fair. But like this
yeah.
idea, so Absu dies because his children murder him. And the reason his
Mhm.
children murder him is they're afraid that he's going to kill them. And as a result of them killing Absu, Tiamat kills all of them. And so it's like, it's this idea of like, sometimes the
Based.
things we fear in the future, when we act on them, they create the situations that cause
Absolutely.
that feared thing to occur. That's the idea of letting go, of saying, I get that it's scary. It is really hard. And you have to be really brave and let that fear go anyways, because fixating on it won't save you right now and it might make things worse. That's
Uh,
what that should be saying. But yeah, I would say
Gotcha.
AA
Yeah,
typically
and
just is
and
like, it's all hopeless. And it's like, no, that's
yeah,
not
and I
it.
don't mean I don't mean to sound like bad faith or anything about the concept of AA and stuff. And that's probably the extent that I know about it. I know the 12 steps, and I know that it was more like I wanted to take responsibility for my actions, and I, like, my first couple of interactions with it, I saw, I maybe that's, I felt like that was the case, and I just kind of ignored it. So I know it goes deeper than that. So I don't want anybody to think that like I'm against. I've seen AA and NA help people, and I don't care what it is. If it helps you, I advocate for it. Which also leads me to a question. It's that I wrote down in terms of recovery. This is a huge argument that I see, and the individual that I mentioned before that passed away, but slightly before was making posts like, "I'm sorry, but if you're on Suboxone, you're not recovered. If you do, if you smoke weed, you're not recovered." What is your view on that? Because I have a very personal view on that myself. Long story short, like I feel like if your demon is heroin, if your demon is porn, if you, at least step one, I feel like if you can beat that particular demon, then that's recovery in itself. But also, as someone who has recovered from a 10-year opiate addiction, um, I I don't know how people who have truly gone the full extent of it would feel about the fact that I do smoke marijuana. I do, I don't mind because I feel like that's not my demon, and that might be, whether or not. Okay, I'll just stop it there. Like, where do you stand on that? Like, what is the definition of to being recovered
Yeah.
to you?
Yeah, I mean, so basically, I go back to these two camps. So typically, people project their shit on people all the time, and I would say addicts do it to just like everyone else, but it seems like they've just, I don't know, they got more shit to project. I see a
Yeah.
lot of these relapse prone individuals who I would argue probably can't do any substances for a large part because most of these relapse prone people that I'm talking about, they've not been addicted to one drug, they've been addicted
Yeah,
to all of them.
just being
Um,
high. Yeah,
yeah.
just dissociating. Yeah.
And so, if you're high relapse prone, if you're a very addictive individual and you do a substance, even not your preferred substance that lowers your inhibitions, the chance of relapse is pretty high for you, right? And so these individuals, they're like, because I do have clients who never use weed ever. They get super clean from meth and heroin, they recover, and then they start using weed and it causes them to relapse. And so now they're like,
Mhm.
they're the staunch view of like, all substances are bad, can't do any. And I'm like, that's probably really true for you. But I've also seen lots of people, and this is probably more of the stress psychosocial form, where it's
Mhm.
like heroin was their weakness, but they're fine doing weed. They're fine
Yeah.
doing, prescribed stimulants for ADHD. Doesn't seem to affect
Mhm.
them in any way. And so my answer is, it seems to be the case that it's probably a bit of both, and you need to figure out which camp you're a part of. And to be honest,
Mhm.
if you're in this camp where you can't have anything ever, that just fucking sucks. And you just got to
Yeah.
reconcile with that. And I think like when they're reconciling that, part of how they handle that is they just like project their shit onto everyone else, and they like try to
Yeah.
tell others like, you're not recovered. And it's like, well, first of all,
Eh,
you're not the professional here. That's probably up to their like
That
individual therapist to discover
exactly.
to
And I
decide.
feel like it's those people that seem to be, when I talk about the discourse between people who have never experienced addiction versus the toxicity and the because I've seen people in recovery treat people trying to be open about their addiction. I've seen them treat them worse than people, even the addiction is a complete choice group of people. Like
Yep.
I've just seen so much toxicity, and I, it bums me out because I feel like every addiction is so individualized, even though there's a ton of things that are similar across the board. But I just feel like it would hurt somebody who, let's say, has been using heroin hardcore for months and months, and they finally are able to get off of it, but they need to to smoke weed or whatever. eh, I feel like to see these people who were able to go through the shit and actually go, be locked up and be into like a forced withdrawal. Because you know what, I feel like it's also probably pretty privileged to get arrested and have to spend 2 weeks in jail and to completely physically withdraw, like that, versus someone who was like willingly cold turkey or on a treatment. But to see them shit on someone who is actively trying to beat that one thing that is affecting their life so bad financially, I feel like a lot of people, everybody's heard of a functioning alcoholic, or just a lot of people are low key. I bet you encounter people on a day-to-day basis that are using methamphetamine, that are doing something, but you'll never know. Like I feel like if you're able to just completely tell someone like, okay, yeah, you kicked the heroin for 3 days, that's easy, but you're smoking weed, you do I feel like that's so toxic and so destructive to recovery as a whole. That's all I give a shit about is recovery. What is if this is the thing that is affecting your life to the point where you are spending your mortgage money, your rent money, your kids' food money, if that's your demon and you can beat that, then you beat it physically. I don't think people understand that there's two sides to addiction, and this might just be I don't know the clinical aspect of this, but it's beating the physical part of it is really really hard. But people don't realize that yeah, once you stop having withdrawals, like there's a whole weird thing going on up here. Like, yeah, you no longer feel shitty, but like your brain doesn't change. It might change eventually, but for a while, like you're still thinking like that. Like, yeah, now I'm the shits or I'm nauseated because I haven't done anything, but like I still have this weird feeling. So I don't think people realize how hard it is to get over that physical part. And yeah, if so you're really going to tell someone that because they're trying to break through that first veil, that because they're doing this or let's beat the part that kills people, which is the physical withdrawal, and then we can address the mental aspect of it. But that's what bums me out a lot is seeing people trying to recover and then saying that it's pointless because they're drinking a beer or I don't know.
Well, it's kind of
But
a misnomer. Like they're hitting on something that's like half true. Because what you're talking about, there's a couple things in here, which is first of all, like I said, there is probably some people who can literally just casually do weed and be fine. There's also other people that do harm reduction, right? And so, like, I'm never gonna shit talk harm reduction because you're right. If it's not
yeah,
killing
that's like
them,
the most important part of
it's
doing any
better.
substance. Yeah.
But the problem that we run into with harm reduction is that sometimes people stop there. Now they can. That is their choice. However, I don't want to sell harm reduction as the same thing as like fully overcoming because there's still this question of what's going on that you can't figure out how to exist without like self medicating specifically. Is it a question of there's a chronic mental health disorder going on? Then we should probably get you to see a doctor to get you
Mhm.
legally medicated and properly
Yes.
managed, right? Because I'm never for self medication, right? So, like a
Yeah.
lot of people that go from heroin, they switch to weed. And I'm like, that's harm reduction. I'm for harm reduction. But let's not
Mhm.
stop there because if you're saying,
Yeah, just
I
don't forget that
must do
there's
weed,
yeah.
there's still addiction at play here. And there's
Yeah.
still some underlying factor that is going to impact your life. And here's the thing. If it's these underlying factors that are driving the addiction, like pain and distress and stuff like that, that is going to impact more than just one area of your life. That's not just going to cause you to use weed a lot. It's also going to impact your relationships. It's also going to impact your job. It's also going to impact your leisure, right? And so like the main piece that I want to say with harm reduction is like it's super valid because it saves lives and they're like I think it's really big of like everyone gets to do their own journey in the way that they need to do it, right? As long as they're not
Yeah.
harming other people, obviously.
Exactly.
But I don't want to sell harm reduction as the gold standard of what people can achieve in their life because I do think there's more, right? I'm sure like a
Absolutely.
lot of people are on Suboxone. They're like, it's nice because I'm not suffering, but I still have like a gray haze over my life. And when they get off
Yeah.
Suboxone, they're like, man, this is such a better life. Like, and so that's
Yeah.
the main piece I want to tease. And like the harm reduction is a huge fight in the metal in like the actual practitioner world where like unironically practitioners try to act like harm reduction is just treating and curing addiction and I'm like
Mhm.
it's not.
Yeah.
It's
And
reducing harm, which is fucking based, but it's
yeah,
not the same
exactly.
thing. It's not the same thing. We're still missing the underlying problem. We're just
Yep.
making it
And
safer.
with that Suboxone subject is for me it's such a passionate topic because when I finally got the balls to ask, like I thought whenever I admitted like, okay, this is why everything's gone to shit, like I had to finally reveal to my wife, like, hey, we have zero money. You know how I said we had money? Yeah, we have none. Like when I got to that point where with my dad and everything, I was when I felt like when I admitted what was going on, that everybody's going to be like, fuck you, I'm out. And the second that they were like, oh shit, like how can we help? Like that was a game changer for me overall. But immediately once I realized like, oh fuck, they don't want to abandon me, they want to help. Um, I started looking up like what I could do, and I went into my Suboxone treatment knowing what it was. Hell, when I was addicted, Suboxone was probably one of my favorite drugs to abuse.
Yeah.
So I went into it knowing the the uh, uh, the possibilities of what I was getting into being harmful or beneficial to my situation. And so I went into it. And long story short, I straight up told my doctors, like, look, for number one, probably the main driving factor was how expensive it was. Not only my treatment appointments versus the cost of the medicine, but I was in that treatment with people who were literally had been going there for 10 years, and they were on the lowest milligram Suboxone strip that was available at a quarter of a strip a day, which in terms of what's going on chemically in your body is doing nothing. But for them and just for the addict in general, which I think translates into like if you're off of your, as long as you have something, like just as long as you feel like you're doing something. But it just blew my mind that these people are in here for so long on paying for something just to take a quarter of it a day, so with Suboxone, it's just such a dangerous situation. But it saved my life. Like it literally saved my life. But I went in saying, "Hey, look, I don't want to do this for more than 6 months. Like I understand what's going on. I want to beat the physical aspect of this, and then once I do that, I'll handle the mental shit alone because we need, we could do all that by ourselves."
Right.
But it's just that doesn't work for everybody. And so that's what upsets me so much is I've seen people's experience with Suboxone and how they can be on it and end up staying on it for 20 years. And methadone's even worse. That's an entire subject. But with Suboxone, like it really taught me how important it is to people to feel like you're doing something.
Right.
Something, like yeah, so
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the issue. So like this is why like with recovery, I kind of try to view it as like what is your goal, right? Because the goal of your recovery is probably going to look different depending on the stage you have in life, right? The first goal of your recovery should probably be to stop doing things that like might kill you, right? Like that's
yeah,
not a bad
yeah,
goal. And if that's your goal, if it takes you 2 years to really fine tune that goal so that you know consistently day in day out with Suboxone, you're not going to engage in behaviors that literally might kill you, that's based. And then 2 years later, you might discover, there's more that I want in life than just not dying. And I think that
yeah,
that's fair too. And so like we
yeah,
have to like make space for people to have these journeys. I just don't want people to glorify and being like 20 years on Suboxone, that's based. I'm like, that's
yeah,
not really what the drug was designed for. Like something went
yeah,
wrong there. If they're content, I'm not going to say it's wrong necessarily,
yeah.
but I have
You're not
questions.
dead,
That's
but
not
yeah,
what this
like
was
if
designed
yeah,
for.
yeah. That's perfect. That's exactly because I had such a, just such a weird relationship with that drug in particular, and then just the community around it. Like I said, to go to my appointments, I was there with everybody else there for the same reason, but in every every single blip on the spectrum, like from the baddest off of the baddest off to like, you know, doctors who were like, oops, I prescribe, like just people in every walk of life. And it just so I guess it just leads back to the primary point of this this whole thing that I'm doing is just I want people to realize that no matter how you got there, no matter how deep you are into it, it is painful to go through it. It is painful to be married to someone go through it. It is painful to have a parent going through it. It is painful to have children going through it. And regardless of if it was 100% their choice, regardless if they had been raised with a silver spoon in their mouth, or if they were dealt the shittiest hand possible. It's fucking shitty. It's such a shitty. And now it was different when you could go to any doctor and get 90 Percocets prescribed to you. It was different when, if you couldn't, you could buy them from your aunt for $5 a piece. But now, through it's on there, but we can ignore it. I feel like the legislation and the bad attempt at addressing the opiate epidemic, um, which in my opinion has led to doctors being so terrified of getting someone, even with chronic pain, addicted to the point that they will not give someone post-op medicine to help them, um, leads, whether or not you just kept someone from getting addicted, you just caused the price of one pill to go from $5 to $8 to $9 to $11 when a bag of heroin is $20 for much more. I feel like that has its own snowball effect.
Yep.
But regardless of all that, like it's fucking shitty. And I want, at least at the bare minimum, if someone you love dies from an overdose, that you can say, when someone asks what happened, you can say they were fighting an addiction and they lost, because that at least forces you at that point to admit that you probably knew. And if you know someone's struggling, instead of, I mean, obviously it's so easy, people do shitty things wrong on this stuff, but at least be aware that these people need help, and there's probably something you can do to at least try to make it better. And don't put all that weight on yourself, but there's it's way better to at least offer as much support as you can versus saying, I wish I could have done more, when you're, at a funeral or something. It's very, I just don't want people to be scared of that. So
Yeah. I mean, it's tricky not to be scared when you see like your loved ones. Which is why I think it's really important that we like look at like what does your goal of sobriety look like, and like how do we make that work for you and for your loved ones around you. And I think we've gotten into this problem in the addiction field where like for so long we were prescribing like a very very rigid understanding of like what recovery has to look like.
yeah,
And the issue is, like I've said, first of all, I'm pretty sure there's at least two major camps of what's even like dominant etiology, and that's probably reductive still. Like probably within this one camp there's going to be a couple of other etiologies within that we have to look at, which is inherently why these things, we're going to, ideally with research we'll find good methods of like how to identify these different groups and which treatments offer the best sequelae. But the field of addiction is, I mean, the origin of it is fundamentally a non-scientific origin, and it's
yeah,
getting better. It is getting better. I'll be clear. Like there's
yeah,
more and more research on it, but a lot, like AA was made by addicts who figured out what they think helped them, and then they systematized it and rinsed it and gave it out to others because no one was helping them. I mean, nobody wanted to do the research on them because addicts were just like unironically the lepers of society. Like they were like, who
yeah,
cares? Who cares what happens to them? Like, hope they do die was kind of society's approach to them.
yeah,
And society's approach to them isn't much better. I would say like we have a lot of people on the left that virtue signal about addiction and talk about how they care. But I'm not fully convinced that they do. And
yeah,
then we have people on the right that don't really virtue signal. They're just like very unashamedly stigmatized and like shitty in their view towards addiction. And there's not very much nuance in between. And the problem is that like addiction is complicated and people are complicated. I mean, we've not even solved mental health. I mean, we haven't solved
yeah, yeah.
depression. And
Like
let's talk
like
about
that. Yeah,
research. Depression has
exactly.
tons of research into it, like
Yeah,
tons and tons of research, and we still haven't really like solved it. And so
yeah,
I think it's really important to kind of like hold this space of like, how do we do both accountability and compassion and hope? We should probably find a way to do all three of these together in the most empirically sound way that we can. Um, and that is going to change as we do more research.
absolutely, man. Okay, last thing before I let you go here, that I have wrote, and I sent a screenshot of the things that I had typed out. to a cousin of mine, and this was his question. Is he said, "What makes a good patient? And if someone has a problem and they know they need help, what mindset do they need to be in before they walk in the door and tell a professional, I need help?" Like, because we all know that like forced or court ordered um uh the rehabs and stuff are probably way less successful than someone being nudged or at least being willing enough to walk in somewhere and admit like, hey, help me out, I'm fucked up. Like, so what mindset like leads to recovery more often, do you think?
For the individual or for people around that individual?
For the individual, broadly speaking, like what is the ideal mindset of a patient coming in, like for the most chances of success in terms of recovery?
I think getting a really honest assessment of where you are, because like I said, different severities are going to need different treatment, right? So if your drug use is not actually impacting your life that much, but you want to stop for whatever reasons that you decide and you just can't, um the level of treatment you might need is probably going to be lesser than somebody who's like homeless, job lost,
Yeah.
and like has a lot of like use related injuries on their body, for example. Like they've got lots of
Hmm.
needle injuries and stuff like that, right?
Hmm.
The intervention is going to vary. So I think like trying to figure out what the accurate intervention level is for yourself and just trying to be like really, really honest about yourself with it, which is really hard to do because of shame, right? Like we want to be
Yeah.
ashamed. And because we're ashamed, we don't want to be honest about how much things are impacting us, and we try to like be like, well, like I'm just tired or I'm just stressed out. So like trying your best. I know honesty is like a very simple thing to say and a hard thing to do.
Yeah, and it's especially probably hard for someone who is so well trained in lying or masking or whatever it is that makes it's hard to be an addict. Like it is literally a full-time job to get what you need.
And it's mind
Like
fucking. Like
it's
you
yeah,
mind
it
fuck
really is.
yourself because of like shame, because of like,
Mhm.
like the criminalization of drugs, which just like leads to like
Yeah.
an additional level of like hiding, because there's a level of like you literally have to hide it because
You
it's
literally
criminal.
can't let any yeah,
Right?
yeah.
So like it's really mind fucking from multiple levels. And so like this is why having hope, a really big thing is if you're an individual who's kind of surrounded by people in chronic drug use, I highly, highly encourage looking at moving towns.
Yeah.
One of the biggest predictors as well of relapse is if you go back to the same situations that prime you to use and you're
Yeah.
around the same people that are still using, you're very, very likely to relapse. Um,
Like even just as simple as like removing yourself as hard as it might be to any place that it is physically there. Like for me, I had jumped this hurdle completely mentally. I knew like to me it was not an option until that shit was right there. So if you can avoid that situation entirely, which is easier said than done, especially for younger people. I see so many people grow up in households that are enabled it at the bare minimum, but a lot of times perpetuated just by it being there, And I live in the South. There's really not a whole lot of shit to do around here. And if that's what's in front of you, like obviously you're gonna do that. What the fuck else is there to do? So as easy as it is to say, um, ideally if you can just just withdraw from any situation that is physically there. I think once you can beat that physical aspect of the entirety of addiction, it's much easier to like to deal with your brain. Like 'cause that's a whole like you said,
yeah.
we understand the brain enough to function, but we don't know what the fuck's going on up there.
Yeah,
So like
I
if you can
really
beat that.
encourage doing a medical detox,
Mhm.
particularly if you're using alcohol or stimulants specifically, and downers for the relapse risk specifically because you're going to be in a lot of pain.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah, terrible.
so medical detoxes just make that easier. Um, So medical detoxes, I always very strongly recommend, like no matter what. Some people like I can't afford it. At least in Canada, it's free here. I don't know if it's free in the States or if there's nonprofits that offer medical detox. I have no
Nothing
idea.
is free in the States.
Well, I think you guys have nonprofits, so I don't know how nonprofits manage that or anything like that. But medically detoxing is a really, really good bet to do. Um, and then just like giving yourself grace and time and realizing like it's going to suck and it's going to suck for a really long time. And then there's going to be days that really suck and you're going to have dreams. Um, After you've medically detoxed, you might have to like psychologically shift. Like a lot of people who've maybe been using like meth for a really, really long time, it often takes them like up to like 6 months to like stabilize. Like I remember working with a client who used actually most dominantly like heroin, and I
Mm.
didn't really notice her personality come out until about like 6 months. And that was a really consistent pattern. Within like 4 to 6 months, I started really seeing my client's personality, which was a bit of them like just adjusting to being in a
Yeah.
rehab center and getting used to me. But another part is just like they would report, they're like, I can actually like focus and like listen and
Yeah.
like hear
Or
things.
feel like the motivation to do, like, it's so easy to do something you like to do if you know you can get a little bit high first, you know what I mean? So, like, having a passion or a hobby or something that you do on a daily basis while you're using, and then you quit that, and then you realize, like, I don't give a shit about that. And you know what I mean? Like, once you get sober, you realize, like, was I only doing those things or hyper fixating on this hobby because it was fun, especially with stimulus. I can imagine with meth and everything that you do something and then you just want to grind out something or work on something and then stripping that away and being like, did I even really like that at all? Because I'm sober now. So I can see after that time and your brain shifting back to normal. And for me, it was, I have chronic pain and everything. So once I got off using but then I tapered completely off my Suboxone, that was probably the best time in my life for me because I realized I had spent the months like not giving a shit about anything else. I was just trying to exist feeling like this now. But like once I started to see that spark in the things that used to bring me pleasure that I guess I with doing it while high or that being such an ingrained part of of my drug use that it was just a breakthrough moment for me to realize like all these things I really do like them or you get that motivation that comes naturally and it's a weird feeling to be able to do something and not feel like you have to gear up beforehand. So yeah,
Yeah.
I can see that breakthrough just being huge. And the to me, I think for anybody, especially anybody, also I'm gonna ignore chat because someone said something that made me salty, but I told myself I wasn't gonna read anything. Um uh I think the physical aspect of it is probably the most challenging for anybody that is like currently going through this. Like for me, like if you can just I think anybody watching a freaking Erudite stream is probably smart enough to realize that it's just bigger than those primal urges. If you can break through that physical bullshit that comes with getting off of something, it makes things so much easier. So the medically or the detox you suggested is probably the play, like it really is because for me, and I know for a lot of people,
I'm
especially
going to
now that
start
fentanyl's
working
so
on
huge,
being less
because
white.
if you use fentanyl, pain pills aren't shit. Heroin probably isn't shit anymore because it's so powerful. If you can just get past that, your body's just yearning for that, it'll probably make every other step. Because you're gonna be, I'm sure everybody. I watched your talk with your last addiction video, like you're always going to be an addict. And whether or not that's a trope or cliche, like you're always going to think about it to some extent. But if you can just get past your body shitting on you because of that, I think that's the play. I really do.
Yeah, another
Uh,
thing to keep in mind of if you feel like you need like inpatient care is typically we see most success for people who go for 3 months straight. So I highly recommend most inpatient rehab facilities are like 1 month long. So try, if you're planning to go into rehab, try to book your medical detox and then 3 months straight of rehab, because there's a lot more success even if you're transitioning back to your original place after just 3 months. Even more success after 6, and then we start to see inpatient like efficacy, like tapering, like more time being not more effective
Yeah.
around 9 months. Like staying beyond 9 months doesn't seem to have much benefit. Between that 6 to 9 is where you're not getting as much bang for your buck anymore with inpatient specifically. So that's just like another little like practical piece to kind of be aware of. Obviously, another really practical piece is like, if a relapse is going to occur and you've been sober for a while, even if you had an insane tolerance before, please ensure that you like at minimum half your dosage. Like really try to reduce it, because your tolerance is way lower,
Yeah.
and that's a really high risk. Another really high risk of practical, just because I want to give some like practical safety stuff.
Yes, please.
Overdoses are at highest risk for relapsing after you've been sober for a while, and if you're using the same dosage in a very, very unfamiliar environment. So if you typically use drugs in the same basement, in the same on the same couch, surrounded by the same things, and then suddenly you're outside in a park at like a night rave, if you use the same dosage, you're at a very high risk of overdose because of CCR, because you don't have the counter conditioning going on to set you back, and you actually don't have the same level of tolerance.
That's
So that's a
crazy.
really big one to understand, is that tolerance is very, very much fluctuated by how familiar are you with use in that environment specifically.
Hmm. Yeah, and that kind of, as much harm reduction as much as you're committed to that, there's probably no skirting that as well, you know. And a lot of it, I know for sure, especially if you're in a social situation or other people using and stuff, like you kind of want to flex. You'd be like, oh, that's nothing. You know, people do it with alcohol all the time. You pussy, you're drunk, you're passing out already. I can drink this much. Um, so that's, I never even took that into consideration, and especially, you know, people like on the relapse, like, man, if you haven't done something in a while, especially if you're not taking like pharmaceuticals, if you're taking something like your normal dose, like you're, there's no reason to, if you've been a couple months, man, it's so spooky to me to think that someone can relapse and not have the ability to know that, what I mean, everybody knows what tolerance is, but to the extent that, like, if you haven't done it in months and you do your same normal comfort daily dose, and it's probably going to put you on your ass, you know. From a teenager, when I started just dabbling in drugs in general, I didn't do a single drug until I looked it up. I was on 420 chan. I was on blue light. I was looking at the, what is it, the LD50. I wanted to know how much will kill me. What is the first plateau? You know, but nobody's gonna take what it can handle. And I think just step one in harm reduction, especially when it comes to relapses, like just, God, don't, just be careful.
Yes.
Just be careful.
Obviously, don't
But,
plan and hope to relapse. That's not the goal of it either.
oh no,
But when it
no,
happens,
no,
well,
God,
I
yeah,
do know, I do have clients who
yeah,
they start hearing, and then the like addiction part of their brain is like, oh, relapse is
yeah,
expected. Well, I'm
yeah.
expecting mine in 2 months at my friend's birthday party. And it's
Exactly.
like, that's not
Yeah.
relapse prevention, just to be
So I
clear.
try to minimize the parroting of relapse is part of recovery. Like, it's okay.
Yes.
You're gonna do it. It's okay. You're gonna relapse. Like, no, you don't. No. Just here are the things you can do to avoid completely. And but all that being said, thank you so much. Uh, I I'm not gonna lie. This was all a ruse, for me to ask you to tell Destiny to answer my emails. I don't care about any of this conversation. I was just
Fair.
kidding. Uh, no, I did reach out to Destiny, but I mean, what the hell does he know compared to
Well, he he
and
he uses substances
that's
himself, so he's going to have a
and
very
that
different experience than I do.
and that's kind of why I spammed him a few emails as well, because it's not often you can find somebody that is like, yeah, I use drugs because I know what they do and I like this experience, and then be able to separate from that. I think that's a beautiful, because I was able to do that with every drug through my experience, but opiates, because obvious reasons. But I think that's an interesting take because I have a very like drugs are okay. Like like drugs can't not okay. Please scratch that. Drugs can be okay, especially
Drugs are
psychedelics.
tools.
Especially,
Drugs are
yeah,
tools.
yeah. I mean,
They
because like
exist on a spectrum of beneficial to
and
problematic use,
exactly,
obviously.
and combined with harm reduction and combined with just a general knowledge of what you're doing, it's a way to live life, and I think it's interesting for the people who have the cognitive power to experience those things and not feel like "Oh, I need this every day for the rest of my life. So, that being said, um, I'm going to post my what this is all for just a documentary that I'm working on. I'm a video editor. I don't stream. I usually do edits and logos and thumbnails for other people. But I have a couple channels that I'm a deck and fence builder. I'm a contractor. That's what I do. I run a channel about all that. But I'm going to post a link to the teaser video in both of your chats for this video. And then I'm not gonna post anything else. If anybody's interested, you can look up Jrayke Media on YouTube and primarily Facebook. My Dex Unlimited channel is YouTube, but I'm doing well on Facebook with my editing stuff. But I posted in the chats, and I want to thank you
Hmm.
again for everything. And I will continue watching your content because it's awesome.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the call.
All
Let me
right,
know
girl.
if
I
you need
really
anything
appreciate
else.
it. I will. I'll shoot you a message, and I will give you credit, for sure. And I'm just gonna. I've been recording all this. I'll just chop it up, and I'll make sure we both look good in it. So,
Awesome. Wonderful.
all right, girl. Thank you
Thank you so
for
much.
everything. Have a good evening.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye bye.